Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the afternoon session. So hopefully everyone knows that in, how many years' time? 10 years' time, Brisbane and Queensland will be hosting the next Olympic, or the Olympic Games, the next one. So today, to talk about how we're going to secure that, we have Ivano and Dirk. So Dirk is from NTT. Put your hand. This is Dirk here. He's a key member of the NTT cyber team, and he has over 2 decades of history and experience in cybersecurity and intelligence. Ivano, on the left over here, he's a lecturer at the University of Queensland. He's a former police officer, and his first-hand Olympic logistical knowledge from when he was in charge of security at the Winter Olympics back in 2006. So please welcome them both.
Thanks. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming on a rather wet Friday afternoon to listen to Ivano and I talk about securing the Olympic Games. It's a topic that we're both very excited to share with you, and Ivano's even got some fantastic photos from his experience at Turin 2006.
So raise your hand if you ever had a dream to be an Olympian or at least an athlete. Come on, don't be shy. I could raise both of my hands. So obviously as kids, we have that dream, right? Being sports people, being cool, competing, trying to win competition from our backyard into the national stage and possibly the global stage, right? So that's exactly what Olympic Games represent for athletes. Being able to showcase your skills, being able to prove that you're the best in the world in your specific field.
Now, the number of hands that weren't raised in the room probably tells us that we're in a room full of cyber professionals. And cyber professionals, for them, the Olympics is something completely different. For a cyber professional, the Olympics is the convergence of 3 of the biggest threats out there. So when we think Olympics, what we think about is cybercrime. Talk about an opportunity for monetization. The Tokyo Olympics, the most recent ones, $13.6 billion was being spent on hosting the Tokyo Olympic Games. You think about the opportunity for cyber criminals to be able to extort that, to be able to defraud spectators of ticket revenues, et cetera, et cetera. Every cyber criminal wants to target the biggest stage, and that really is the Olympics. Let's talk about nation states. Now, the Olympics is one of those things that has a lot of national pride, perhaps even a little bit of national ego involved. And, you know, if something doesn't quite go your way at the Olympics, one way that you might be able to respond is in the cyberscape. And then we get to hacktivists. We keep saying how big of a stage the Olympics offers people. What better place for hacktivists to show off their skills, literally on the world's largest stage. And in addition to that, if they do have a cause that they're going for, it's a great opportunity to market that cause. But with all of this, you're probably all asking, but you know, how bad can it really get? What really happens at Olympics Games? Well, probably the worst threat that has ever been observed at the Olympics happened at the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics a couple of years ago. Now, the Winter Olympics is a little bit different to the Summer Olympics, and Ivano will talk about that one shortly. But ultimately, they're both pretty significant events on the world stage. And immediately prior to Pyeongchang's opening ceremony, IT started to go down. Ultimately, what had happened is a malware called Olympic Destroyer, wiper malware, had been deployed. It had been exquisitely targeted to the point where it started taking out domain controllers for the opening ceremony and for the Olympic Committee's infrastructure in place. After the fact, when organisations started getting hold of the source code of Olympic Destroyer and started doing some analysis of it, the first thing anybody noticed is that by the source code, it looked very North Korean. And suddenly everybody said, South Korean Olympics, North Korean threat, that makes perfect sense. It must have been a North Korean threat. A little while later, somebody looked a little bit more closely at the source code and went, actually, that looks almost identical to some of the code in NotPetya. Therefore, it's got to be a Russian threat. The reality was that the malware was hidden so well and written so well with tells of multiple nation states involved that nobody could really attribute it for quite some time until somebody found a correlation, which was that in the command and control infrastructure for Olympic Destroyer, there was one IP address, which is also turned up in a previous campaign, which had been positively attributed to the Russian GRU military intelligence organization. So from that point forward, most people are saying probably this was a Russian attack, and probably it was around the national pride and national, as I said, potentially national challenges with not being able to compete under their own flag at the Olympics, with cyber being a great way for them to respond partially covertly.
So what we're going to do today is we're going to try and take you through a bit of a journey, right, through different editions of the Olympic Games. Now, in 2006, when I was very, very young and I had much less gray hair than today, I was actually lucky enough to work for the Turin 2006 Winter Olympic Games. I was hired as a deputy venue security manager. I don't know if it's because I was an ex-police officer or because of my amazing skills or a combination of both, doesn't really matter. But I had actually a chance to work for the organizing committee of the Winter Olympic Games. Now, those games were actually quite different from a cybersecurity perspective to games that we could think of today. We did have a lot of threats, but they were mainly physical threats, right? Three in particular were the threats that we were really covering for and trying to prepare for. The first one was the attempt by the Italian and the French government to build a high-speed train from Lyon to Turin, and something that encountered a lot of opposition, in particular from environmental groups. Okay, so there was a lot of attention towards preparing for possible acts and possible attacks by those groups. The second one was the fact that Italy was going through a bit of a rough time in terms of countering and facing militant Islam groups. There had been some arrests in the months leading up to the games, and that obviously heightened and increased the tension from a physical security perspective. And last but not least, in 2001, so 5 years prior, Italy hosted the G20, and there was a massive issue with the security in Genova, where there was obviously a couple of people losing their life and a lot of issues from a security perspective. So all of these created an environment in which security had to really be taken care of and really planned accordingly. From a cyber perspective, just to give you a bit of an overview of where we are at the moment, those were the months and the years where Stuxnet was actually developed. Okay, so we can actually say we were at the dawn of cyber attacks and cyber breaches as we conceive them today. And now the mechanisms that we put in place in terms of security at the organizing committee for the Winter Olympic Games in 2006 was quite articulated. And the Turin 2006 Games were the first structured attempt by security to blend in the capability and the capacity of civilians, as in people working for security for the organizing committee, like myself, and law enforcement, okay? So we had a security and safety group that was actually in charge of doing security coordination and planning and different security venues. I was in charge of venue security as a deputy, of course, with the main media center, which is where all the media, being that press, being that journalists, being that radio, TV, and so on, would converge during the games. So as you can understand, there was quite a complex situation to secure, in particular because of the complexity of stakeholders that were coming to the venue, and also the complexity of the technology that was associated with it. We had something like 20,000 law enforcement. There were numerous no-fly zones created during the games, in particular before and after the opening and the closing ceremony. And this is something that we never got a chance to see directly, but we knew that in the mountains around Torino, where there were the Olympic venues, there was something like 300 snipers ready to intervene if things got to an escalation to the breaking point, okay? Last but not least, tons and tons and tons of volunteers to manage. And this is something that oftentimes with Olympic Games we tend to forget. Without volunteers, Olympic Games simply don't happen.
And I guess from a cyber perspective, Ivano, What do the volunteers mean in cybersecurity?
Well, of course, insider threats, okay? So massive potential for insider threats there. Back then, the main cyber instance and the main potential threat from a cyber perspective, because of the configuration of the networks, was literally somebody with a compromised device, being that a USB stick or being that a laptop, plugging into the network, so with access to the venue, being able to compromise the network. But luckily, we didn't really have any issues from that
I'm just glad they weren't in the sniper team.
Absolutely. So the focus there from a security perspective was really a layered security approach one-on-one, okay? Progressive access credentials, being able to protect the core of your venues, and then establishing concentric circles and giving different credentials in terms of physical access to the venue, to the people that had to work in the Olympic Games. In all honesty, if I'm thinking of, for example, Brisbane 2032, Winter Olympic Games tend to be easier to manage from a security perspective because they tend to have a smaller territory. They tend to, the venues tend to be spread across a smaller radius. And from a physical security perspective, especially also because of the fact that you're dealing with mountains and physical barriers, tend to be easier to manage. Obviously, my time, I would say, was spent 80% in doing security planning, which translated in this 120-page venue security plan, which we had to prepare in the lead up to the game. So detailed where we even had to take pictures of security seals that we would put on the doors across the venue and specify the different details about when the seals were put there, in case the seals were broken, why they were broken, and so on and so forth. And believe me, they were broken very, very, very many times, not for malicious reasons, but because of negligence and because of the fact that people, at the end of the day, needed to get things done. And probably the remaining 20% of my time, obviously, during the games in themselves, was spent coordinating security. So we did a lot of planning for treating things as business as usual, and then you get the kickoff of the games, and it all becomes a massive, consistent, cohesive contingency.
It's a bit like that old sporting saying from Mike Tyson of everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, right?
Absolutely, and I can tell you, being punched in the face actually was quite common, not because of anything in particular, but because of the nature of the games, right? So from an IT infrastructure perspective, I must confess, things were quite easy back then. The situation was a typical situation in which, and you know, sometimes in cybersecurity we joke about it these days, you could literally simply unplug things from the internet and everything would be fine, okay? And the company that was managing IT, sorry, Dirk, it's one of your competitors.
That's okay, we got Tokyo.
Yeah, of course you did. Kind of did things quite well from that perspective. The infrastructure was quite simple, honestly speaking. There was a game management system, which was pretty much the part of the network that would allow operators to translate people swiping their badges and access cards into credentials for access to the different sites and the different components of the venue. And an information diffusion system, which, as the name itself says, was nothing but the system to collect data about things such as events, athletes, competitions, and so on and so forth, and push them out to the audience, to spectators, and so on. Overall, the contractor employed something like 2,000 IT people, 385 servers, 5,000 computers. So, you know, thinking of the scale, and Dirk is going to talk about it with the reference to Tokyo, things were quite different back then. We didn't really have many cyber breaches, properly speaking. Probably the main one which I can remember of was the case of this contractor that was picked up saying something along the lines of, if I want, I can just simply go on the site and mess up the network and cause massive damage. And obviously somebody, probably law enforcement, heard this person saying this. They went there and they said, all right, we need to have a chat about it, right? But that's as far as it went, really. We didn't really have any many issues from that perspective because of the nature of the event, but also because of the configuration of the IT infrastructure. That was probably the last time in history, I could say, that an Olympic event didn't really raise so many concerns from a cybersecurity perspective. Beijing 2008 actually showed us afterwards that things started getting very, very challenging for main events from that perspective.
Absolutely. And you did say that the Olympics were one big contingency, and I think from that photo and the change in hair color, it probably was a pretty stressful experience at the time.
Absolutely.
Love that photo, by the way.
Yes, thanks for that.
So let's move forward 14 years to Tokyo. Now, probably the first thing that everybody will notice about Tokyo 2020 is that it actually occurred in 2021. Tokyo, if you remember, was an Olympic Games that was the first Games to be postponed by a year, or postponed at all, since World War II. So it's not something that happens at all. Olympic Games, the show must go on irrespective of anything else. But with the hitting of COVID, the COVID pandemic, the Games had to be postponed initially. And immediately in the lead up to the next iteration of the Games, which was Tokyo 2020 in 2021, the third wave of COVID was hitting Japan. So in the 8 weeks prior to the Olympics, they became a much more digital Olympics than they were already going to be. Because quite literally, you couldn't have any spectators in some stadiums. That experience had to be streamed out to other people. And indeed, in other stadiums, you could only have a much smaller number of spectators than you otherwise would have had. But let's talk about the Digital Olympics. What did that actually look like? Well, I don't know if you've ever been to a swimming event, but you kind of sit there watching and there's these things moving in the pool and they're going really, really fast. And you go, oh, that's cool, Australia's winning. And then it turns out to be somebody else entirely. It's really hard to see. So in a lot of the events where spectators could be there, augmented reality was deployed. And what this meant was that spectators could actually have that experience of going, yes, that is my team that's winning, and I'm not going to look like an idiot by cheering when I shouldn't be cheering. But in addition to that, robotics featured very heavily in the Olympics. Now, everybody's probably seen YouTube videos of robots in Japan. It is definitely part of the tech scene over there, but robots were used extensively in the Olympics. Everything from camera vehicles at the golf, and I'll talk a little bit more about that one shortly, through to welcome robots at various venues where people were able to go, right through to the point that in the Olympic weightlifting, where you've got these really strong people lifting the weights and then dropping them, some of the volunteers that Ivano talked about then have to pick up those weights and put them back on a rack afterwards. So robotic exoskeletons were actually used to allow those volunteers to not break their back while they're doing that, because usually they're not quite at Olympic level with the weights that are involved. So lots of robotics. And the other big thing that was prevalent was this idea of how can we project the experience beyond the venues themselves. Now you'll see the golf in the top right-hand corner there, and some people are probably looking at that going, it looks a little bit like something off an Xbox or perhaps a Nintendo Switch. And that's because it was a recreated scene. What happened at the golf and at the badminton that I'll talk about on the next slide is that there were cameras literally everywhere, and the data was being extracted from those cameras, and in almost real time, models were being created so that you could actually create a spectator experience for people outside of the venue, and they could actually pan cameras, move around as if they were actually there and moving to a different vantage point at the golf. It's the first time in history that it's ever been done at scale without a studio being involved. So typically these things are done on green screens and very specialist cameras, all fixed locations and the like. All of this was done in real time using cameras on real backgrounds of trees and so on and so forth. Now, the one that I like the most though is this one here, which you'll see at the top of the screen is a 55-meter long television, and it's floating. That's pretty cool. That TV is in the bay where they were conducting the sailing events. It's called Karari is the system. It came out of the back of some research that NTT did as part of our telco arm. And ultimately what it is it's a way to immerse spectators in a sport of sailing, because if you've ever been to sailing before, you can see a bit of it, but a lot of it happens a long way off from where you're able to see it. So this TV is fed by a fleet of, which is a number of, it's not as impressive as it sounds, of drones carrying these camera rigs that you can see on screen there. Each of those 4 cameras is a 4K camera, and it's taking footage consistently and streaming it back to the TV. as are a number of boats also carrying fixed 4K cameras, watching everything that's going on, and then everything is stitched together in real time so that spectators can watch it on the very large screen that's quite close to them. When COVID hit, it became important to be able to take that experience and put that elsewhere. So the Japanese government set up other venues that people could, in a socially distanced manner, watch the sailing from. So these TVs were all installed in other facilities as well. So in near real time, sailing's happening, drones are flying, boats are going around taking footage. Everything was being beamed back via private 5G that was installed specifically for the games, and then put onto the TV and then streamed by literally thousands of kilometres of brand new fibre that was installed just for the Olympics. Absolutely phenomenal uplift in the amount of technology that was in place in Tokyo so that the Olympics could be what they were. On the bottom right-hand side of the screen, this is the badminton that I mentioned. Now, badminton is historically really hard for anybody to film, period, because the little shuttlecock moves really, really fast, and it's kind of small as well. So most cameras don't really pick up a great deal of it, and you don't really get to see much of the event that's happening. You just see people kind of running around without the shuttlecock itself. With technology being the way that it is, for the Tokyo Olympics, they were actually not only able to film it, extract that data in real time, recreate the scene both virtually and in holograms, by the way, for people to be able to watch the badminton in a spectator-like experience anywhere else that they happen to be that had the holograms projecting. So super, super, super connected. Most people in this audience are probably sitting there going, wow, that's a lot of IT infrastructure. That's a lot of new things that must have gone in to make that happen. I can tell you that NTT's infrastructure, so we were a gold sponsor, one of a number of gold sponsors, so just ours alone, we went from having hundreds of thousands of endpoints on our network to having literally hundreds of thousands more endpoints in about an 8-week period in the lead up to the games for the 8-week period of the games, the Olympic Games plus the Paralympic Games. So phenomenal amount of additional data to be able to collect and monitor and do something with in a cyber sense as it happens. And most people are probably sitting there going, wow, what an attack surface. Like, attack surface of the office back in Brisbane or Sydney, not so impressive when you compare it to something like this at the Olympics. And just to talk concepts, I guess, before we talk about what actually happened when the Olympics kicked off, the idea of attack surface is really important. It tells us where cyber criminals, nation states, hacktivists can actually find ways into the network. Threat is also a really important concept here. So threat is ultimately capability times intent, like it says. So it's basically saying if there's a group that has the capability to attack you, i.e. they've got the skills and a reason to do so, then there's a threat there that we need to talk about. Very different to risk. And the reason I say that is risk is all about consequence. Risk is all about something happening. And in the case of the Olympics, there's a few major things that we worry about. One of the big things we worry about is the show stopping. So if the telecast stops, if the streaming can't get out to the broader world, if the event has to be postponed, anything like that, that's the big consequence that people are really worried about. And another big consequence that everybody's always very worried about is back to that monetization and fraud thing. We have a lot of spectators who pay a lot of money, oftentimes who do it via a ballot, so it's a little bit of luck if you even get a ticket. If you then get defrauded and some fraudster makes off with the money that you've paid to potentially get a ticket and the ticket never arrives, that's a really bad thing for the image of the Olympics. So threat versus risk, quite different in this context. Threat is ransomware group, nation state, so on and so forth. Consequence, games stopping, somebody stealing money. So let's talk about what actually happened at the Olympics. The good news is, despite the very large growth rate in the number of attacks, you'd certainly be happy with that growth rate in any business, but going from 400 to 450 million between Turin and Tokyo is quite a big jump in the cybersphere. There were no attacks that actually made it through and postponed any events or stopped any streaming, so on and so forth. The threats that did eventuate were quite interesting though. On the bottom left of the screen, you'll see there's a very, very, very realistic log-on screen. This was a log-on screen that was sent in a phishing campaign to another gold sponsor who was providing other parts of the IT infrastructure, and ultimately it was used to steal a whole bunch of credentials that then could have subsequently been used to perform an attack. The other thing that we saw a lot of through the games was the Emotec malware / group. Emotec is well known in the banking space. It's all about stealing logon details for internet banking and stealing money, essentially. It's also widely used in botnets, though. So when people see it in the context of an Olympics, it's kind of that thing of, is somebody thinking about DDoS type considerations. The final one is really interesting, and this was another wiper malware that was deployed just before the Tokyo Games. It was about 2 weeks or so when it was initially detected. And what ultimately happened is quite a number of people in Japan received an email with what looked to be a PDF in there. It was actually an executable file masked as a PDF. If they clicked on that PDF, what ended up happening is the malware started, and the people who did the source code analysis on this found a few interesting things when the malware kicked off. First interesting thing is that it looked for a whole range of file types, including specific file types that come out of a Japanese-only word processor. So very targeted, timed for the Olympics, targeted so that it works in Japan, even though they perhaps use a different word processor to other parts of the world. The second interesting thing about it was that as it goes through its process of trying to find files to wipe and then wiping the files, it would also take the infected endpoint off to a really dodgy adult website. And then the third thing is it would delete itself, including all of the other files on the endpoint. And the theory behind that ultimately is that when a forensic investigator comes in after the fact, everybody thinks the attacker is ultimately looking at it going, they probably won't find the malware because it's deleted itself, but they probably will find the log that says you went to a dodgy website, and therefore the conclusion might be that you got infected that way rather than from a wiper malware campaign in this particular case. Now, this threat's never been attributed to my knowledge. Perhaps it was by some governments, but not publicly attributed anyway. Has a little bit of the hallmarks of perhaps a nation-state type attack when you talk about that misattribution, when you talk about the fact that there was no extortion or anything like that. It could have also just been somebody in the hacktivist space or script kiddie space really just trying to show off what they could actually do. So interesting threat, but again, in terms of a risk, the consequence was never actually realized. So what I've got up on screen here are 4 of the key lessons that were published publicly from NTT after our experience with the games. And really what they're intended to do in this context is to say, what are some of the things we need to think about, or the lessons we need to take from Tokyo 2020 and apply them for Brisbane 2032? The first one is about data. Now, I talked about the fact that we went from hundreds of thousands of endpoints to hundreds of thousands more endpoints all in an 8-week period. Every single endpoint in that network has what we call the trifecta deployed. There's 3 separate vendor products, which I won't name here, deployed to basically provide EDR with high fidelity telemetry off the endpoint, as well as a URL filtering capability, so to get really clear data about what that endpoint is trying to communicate with, as well as a vulnerability management capability so that we can have near real-time updates on whether any of our endpoints across that wide variety of attack surface are actually doing something that they shouldn't in terms of patch status and the like. Ultimately, the idea was, and the way that the threat responses worked, is we aimed at stopping the first breach. So if you stop the first breach, the second, the third, the fourth, and ultimately the final one where ransomware encrypts the system or whatever it is actually happens, that can never happen if you stop it at the initial reconnaissance or the initial breach stage. The second piece was noting the scale of the infrastructure in Tokyo. It literally isn't and wasn't possible to keep everything perfectly hygienic in terms of a cyber hygiene environment. You can't make sure everything is 200% patched and everything is connected right and has all the right agents on it, etc., all of the time. There is just too much on that network. So there was quite detailed processes put in place to ensure that when it mattered, when that risk was about to or could be realized, i.e. right before an event in a venue, quite detailed processes to then go through and sweep all of the IT infrastructure and make sure that it actually had cyber hygiene applied appropriately so that when that risk was realized, it couldn't actually be realized. Third point is around training and simulation and red teaming. Wargaming over and over and over for literally the 2 years prior to the Olympics. We had 200 people in the government SOC for the Olympics. There were other companies that had significant numbers in there as well, plus a very large contingent of Japanese government. all of those organizations were wargaming 2 years in advance of the Olympics, and also testing, and to the fourth point, testing their processes, learning to collaborate, learning who was who in the zoo and who was doing what in each particular part of the organization, such that when the ongoing contingency happened, people at least knew who to pick up the phone to or what to put into the system to get the job to work properly.
So, I mean, it's impressive to think about, us going from 400 instances or cyber instances from a cybersecurity perspective in Turin 2006, and really probably one or two serious ones into 450 million instances with Tokyo. At the same time, if you switch this discussion around, obviously we need to think about the different experience that audience, but even athletes and even society in general has been able to take advantage of from in a time span of a relatively short time span. We're really talking about 16 years, right, from Turin 2006 to today. So the point now is, where next? What are we going to do next? What is going to happen with Brisbane 2032? What are the next 10 years and plus, because we also need to keep into account legacy, what are they going to look like? How do we prepare for that? So we wanted to kind of conclude our presentation with a bit of a reflection on some of the mega trends that we see potentially eventuating in the next 10 years, right? The first one, which is a very, very important one, and it's something that here in Australia particularly is certainly relevant, the need for greater accessibility, okay? We're talking about large events that happen once every 2 years, if you consider the alternation of winter and summer Olympic Games. But we also still talk about people in remote areas that don't have physical access to those games, right? Because they cannot travel, because of whatever reason, right? So one of the key questions that we're going to need to find answers for in the next 10 years is, how are we going to give greater accessibility for the games? Not just in a geographical perspective, from a geographical viewpoint, also thinking of people that have different abilities, right? Obviously, together with this, it means that we're going to need to cater for large-scale customizations of the user experience and of the customer and the audience experience, right? So understanding that there's going to be more and more of a blend between the physical and the digital world, and understanding, A, from a business perspective, how does that translate in different products and in different technologies, and B, from a cybersecurity perspective, how does that translate from a protection standpoint. Another piece to add to the picture is that probably some of the technology is already there. We're going to be likely to see an evolution of it, but we can already start putting our hands onto it. And the reference here is to the Metaverse, for example, right? Something that we all have heard about, we talk about. We can't really just define it very well just yet. This idea of having an always-on virtual environment that is not just an add-on to our physical life and to what we do and how we breathe and how we live, it's something that runs in parallel, right? Really the concept of second life taken in a very literal way, okay? Associated with that, obviously, with the advancement of technology, things such as, and I'm sure that in a cybersecurity audience, this is a really appealing topic, the role of e-games, the role of esports, okay? How are they going to change in the next 10 years, all right? How are we going to be able to have people with different abilities and with different profiles and different personas compete on the global stage, okay? So even not very athletic individuals like my friend Dirk here will be able to actually...
what are you saying?
will be able to actually compete in the sports arena. That obviously is going to need to go together with digital transformation at scale, and we all know that. We don't really know how that's going to look like, but we all know that. Last but not least, something that we need to always keep in mind, with advancement and progress in technology comes also a major impact on our world, impact on materials, impact on environment. So we're going to need to cater for a different level of sustainability from an energy consumption perspective, and so on and so forth.
I think, ultimately, the organising committee has already said that this is going to be a cost-neutral and a carbon-neutral game. So, to make that happen, I see that as a huge opportunity for our industry and the technology industry more broadly. Unfortunately, we're probably not the only people who see the huge opportunity in all of that. And ultimately, we need to think about this in terms of cybersecurity implications as well. To begin with, let's look at even Tokyo and the new types of devices and the new types of connectivity that were required to enable that experience last year, let alone the Brisbane experience in 10 years' time. Right now, we've got some great technology out there, and there's a lot of the vendors in this conference that can secure IoT really, really well. But what about securing the metaverse? What about securing property within the metaverse? There's even talk already of tickets for the Olympics being NFTs. How do we secure those? How do we make sure that people don't get defrauded out of those, as we saw at the Tokyo Games with some of those attacks that we talked about?
And very important on that note, Dirk, what are the underlying legal frameworks that we have to prepare for the metaverse, for example, right? There's been already occasions, I believe it's just after Meta was launched and Facebook turned into Meta, where there's been cyberbullying online. Very serious examples and very serious cases of cyberbullying. Now, if you take that to the extreme and start thinking about how does that work in an environment where there's digital athletes and physical athletes competing, and there's also audience from a digital perspective, wearing their AR and VR devices and trying to enjoy the experience, that creates massive opportunities for episodes such as, for example, cyberbullying from that perspective.
For sure, Ivano. And I can't see a world where by the 2032 Olympics, right now in Turin and certainly in Tokyo, people were able to compete and then go back to the athletes' village and be shielded from a lot of what goes on in social media and the like. Probably not quite as easily in Tokyo as it was in Turin, but by the time we get to Brisbane 2032, I reckon there's going to be all sorts of push for athletes to actually engage with spectators after their event and talk about how the event worked. Going back to Mike Tyson that we mentioned earlier, I mean, look at that recent aircraft incident where somebody engaged slightly the wrong way, and look what resulted in that case. No charges though. But at the end of the day, you can see that happening where there's nations involved, there's national pride involved, there's ego, and even the situation where somebody just has a cause that they want to make known, the whole TikTok effect effectively, to be able to do that with athletes via the metaverse, that's a whole new cyber problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just conscious of time, so just to close on this. Now, when I was preparing this presentation, I was really thinking about the trajectory of cybersecurity as a domain, from my personal experience with Turin in 2006 to Tokyo, and then moving forward to Brisbane 2032. In Turin, I can say that with reasonable confidence, the idea was that cybersecurity was actually a function of physical security. Get your physical security right, and you're pretty much sure that nothing's going to happen from a cyber perspective. Then obviously, as we progressed over the years, the two things started blending in a little bit, and we know cybersecurity started having really more and more prominence. Now, the point now is, are we going to get to the point, and this could be the case with Brisbane 2032 or even earlier editions of the Olympic Games, where the equation will be really swapped around, right? And the physical security is going to become a function of cybersecurity. That's certainly a question that we need to ask ourselves. Now, to conclude on a positive note, I believe, and certainly that's the case, speaking to an audience of cybersecurity vendors and players and organizations, there's certainly going to be a great potential to work on developing technologies, solutions, working on the human factor, and really strengthening our cybersecurity legacy towards 2032 and after that for sure. So we wanted to conclude our presentation with a bit of a call for action, and as we started talking about being as kids keen to engage in sports and compete at the global level, let's all be cyber defense gold medalists at Brisbane 2032. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Ivano and Dirk. That was a fantastic talk. There were a few questions, but we're probably out of time, but a lot of those were around intel sharing between different groups and obvious things like that. So, and perhaps even a call for cyber security volunteers might be something on the cards, you never know. Yeah. So please thank these guys again. Make a little gift, you guys.
Oh, wow. also got a gift. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So well, the next talk at 2:30, in a few minutes' time. So see you soon. Don't leave the room. This is going to be the best room, best talk.
Thank you.